All right, so let's dive into some of the questions that that people are writing in with. So Kim wants to know, she says, I have a 3.5-year-old grandson. He's been gluten-free now for 5 months. He's still experiencing GI issues and not gaining weight. What would you suggest for next steps? I would suggest asking, or looking at his gluten-free diet. What kind of gluten-free diet is he following? Most people follow that wheat, barley, and rye-free diet, but they continue with things like oats, corn, rice, sorghum, millet, teff, and other grains. And they don't really dive into the true gluten-free diet. And that's where you have to go first. Now, you might also look at, with youngsters like that, dairy is oftentimes a problem of persistence as well, because of the cross-reactivity that can occur with dairy and gluten. So again, I would look at those 2 areas first, and then if he continues to struggle, don't wait. Get the child in and get the child in to see somebody who's qualified in nutrition, somebody with similar credentials as myself, who can really help you navigate that diet through the right testing. Because really, a lot of times it's testing that helps give us the answer that we're missing with elimination diets and guesswork. Let's see here. Shinquilla says, what are reasons other than actually eating gluten products? Also, if endoscopy came out normal, is it safe to think gluten-free lifestyle is working, or can you still be exposed even if endoscopy is normal? So an endoscopy is, you can do an endoscopy, you can get a false negative or a false positive on an endoscopy. Remember, your small intestine is 22 foot long, right? So if we look at the small intestine, and so generally, if this is the stomach, and this is the small intestine down here, right? What happens, the doctor will run that scope in, and they'll take little samples, and most biopsies, they take about 4 samples. To technically to diagnose villus atrophy and to really get good accurate data, you need 6 to 8 samples. Most GI doctors take only about 4. And so imagine this is 22 foot long and it has the surface area of the size of a tennis court. So it's vast. Your small intestine is vast in size, considering that it's wrapped all up inside of you, right? Folded up so beautifully. But you can take biopsy samples and there may not be damage where that doctor took the sample. And so there could be damage here. Maybe the damage is here. Maybe the damage is here. And they just didn't take the samples from those areas. It doesn't mean you don't have damage. It just means the areas where they took the sample didn't have damage. So you've got to understand there are limitations to doing a biopsy. And this is why it's important, if you're going to rely on a biopsy for data, that you really talk to the GI doctor you're working with and make sure they're taking enough biopsy samples to give you more accuracy as opposed to less. Let's see here. So somebody says, I just received a 6-pack of certified gluten-free risotto rice. I also ordered gluten-free fried rice. So I'm glad you put that scary face there, and hopefully this information helps you to send those products back so that you don't damage yourself. Is it true that, no, let's see, let's move to, that's not a, so Robert says, oh no, I had Chinese steamed rice earlier. I feel guilty. Good. Feel very guilty, Robert, and change it. Change the diet. What's your thought on organic cauliflower rice as a substitute for basmati rice? I think it's a great substitute. Absolutely. Just take a food processor, get you some whole cauliflower, cut it up, grind it in that food processor. You'll have a nice powdery rice substitute that you can use. Let's see. Does white rice have less gluten than brown rice? No, it's not. White or brown, it's not about how much or less gluten is there. They both have pretty much similar amounts of gluten, so you're being hammered either way. As far as heavy metals, though, as I mentioned earlier, brown rice tends to have more of the toxic heavy metals than white rice. A healthy replacement for rice. I think somebody just mentioned cauliflower rice, vegetables, healthy replacement, vegetables, other food, right? We all get stuck on this in our mind. This is just really a leap in the mind that most people need to make. Going from a high carbohydrate diet, which is basically what many people who are on this traditional gluten-free diet, they're just substituting one grain for another. And so there's carbohydrate, they're still loading on carbohydrates, and that high level of carbohydrate is still contributory to the imbalance and part of their problem. So think of substitutes not as like a direct substitute. If you really want to substitute, just eat something different. And don't tell yourself you're losing yourself because you're losing food. A lot of people think they're depriving themselves of something, and I would say what you're really doing if you continue to eat poorly is you're depriving yourself of health, right? You're not depriving yourself of food, you're depriving yourself of health. Switch the narrative in your mind, because then it's very easy to make the diet change and not feel like you're struggling or depriving yourself. But if you want to be healthy, it requires a greater degree of consistency in the right diet. And again, eating the rice is not going to get you there. I like this. This Mandy chimed in. Rice flour gives me brain fog and irritability. And then offers up a suggestion on something else, which is cassava flour. She says cassava flour works well for French crepes. Yeah, because you've got cassava, arrowroot, tapioca are all options. You got to be careful with those other flour options, and one of the reasons why is they can be high glycemic, and so if you overdo them, you can still hurt yourself. If you're eating heavy glycemic load. Let's see. Yeah, so somebody's chiming in. Juice Plus has rice in it. Should one stop taking? Yeah, I mean, here's one of the problems. One of the problems we actually have products online that you can trust is because the supplement industry, they love taking this right here. Rice flour, rice starch. And they love, because it's super cheap to get a hold of, and they put it as a filler in their supplements. And I even see this, a lot of brands they're claiming to be gluten-free brands, but they haven't read the research. And companies that are catering to people with gluten-free needs that haven't read or updated themselves on the research, in my opinion, they need to get it right. If they're going to cater to an audience, they need to understand what the need of that audience is. And so this is one of those areas where you have to really be careful and read the labels on your supplements, because rice is a super common filler, corn is a super common filler, and they still label those products gluten-free even though technically they shouldn't. I meant to put the study up for you tonight. There's a brand new study that just came out on corn last month. It's not the first study on corn, it's just one in a line of multiple studies on corn gluten showing that people with gluten sensitivity, most of them react to corn just as aggressively as they react to wheat in terms of inflammatory response. So you want to know that. Many of you may be, maybe I just took away two things from you tonight, corn and rice, but hopefully if you've read my book, No Grain, No Pain, or you followed me for any length of time, hopefully this isn't brand new information for you, but if it is, dive in and get it done. What about cultures eating rice for a long time? What about it? That's another question I get a lot, and my answer is I don't really care that cultures have been eating rice for a long time. Cultures have also been dealing with disease for a long time. So, we have to look at, just because a food might be a common thing in a culture. I mean, my culture is German and Irish, and what have we been doing for years and years and years, right? Beer, which is full of gluten and not good for you. The alcohol is not good for you, and it can make you sick, but it's part of culture. It is. There's no doubt about it, right? And what else do we do in the Irish culture? Lots of whiskey and spirits derived from grain, which is also not good for you and also problematic. So just because something is famous or popularized in a culture doesn't make it healthy, and we have to forget that, especially if you're gluten sensitive. It doesn't matter what the culture is. If you're gluten sensitive, you have to address your diet needs so that you can recapture your health and maintain it. Are regular potatoes okay? Yes, regular potatoes are gluten-free. They're grain-free. Now, you can overdo any starchy carb, and that, this is where you got to be careful. Is a lot of people, when they go for the potatoes, they don't go for a small serving, a reasonable serving of potatoes. They get like that massive GMO baked potato, and then they pack it full of, full of fake bacon bits and fake cheese and fake butter, and they pay a price. So, it's not so much potatoes that are a problem, so much as it is the quantity and what you put in it, what you add to it. So you just have to be cautious about those things. Okay, what are the worst foods when trying to get rid of candida, and what are the best foods? Worst foods if you're trying to get rid of candida are heavy carbs, high carb foods. High carbs, simple, we'll say high simple or easy access carbs. And this includes a lot of your fruit like grapes, bananas, and the like. These things are yeast food, right? What will yeast do with carbohydrates? Yeast will ferment carbs. And what happens when yeast ferments carbs? You get wine right there in your gut. Your gut becomes a wine factory. So then the yeast gets stronger, they grow. And when yeast grow, they don't just produce wine, they also produce something called a hyphal wall protein. And a hyphal wall protein looks like gluten to your body. So this is one of the reasons why people also go on gluten-free, continue to struggle. Even though they are gluten-free, it's because they have a yeast overgrowth, because they're overcarbing, and that yeast overgrowth is driving up the production of these proteins that yeast produce that mimic gluten and create a persistent gluten-like reaction. Best foods to eat if you're trying to get rid of candida, vegetables, meats, nuts, all okay. Is there a test to see if you're sensitive to rice? There's a test to see if you're gluten sensitive. Genetic testing. We can put a link up there for you. But if you're trying to know whether or not you need to be gluten-free, in my opinion, genetic testing is what you want. This is the best way to know. And the reason why, as I mentioned earlier, the biopsy you can get a false negative. The blood work that oftentimes measures for different antibody responses to wheat or barley or rye or other things, those can also be misleading. So a lot of times you get false negative on those types of tests as well. So genetic testing, if you have positive genotype for gluten sensitivity, you avoid gluten. And that includes rice gluten, that includes wheat gluten, that includes corn gluten, it includes all the grains if you want to really recover. What about tofu or soy? Tofu and soy soy is a legume, so it's not a grain. And tofu is the fermented byproduct of soy. And so I would say where you have to be careful there with soy is many people don't do well with soy because it's very challenging to digest. And so if you're gluten sensitive and you've been eating gluten and your gut's damaged, right, and you're trying to recover, if you just start putting a bunch of soy substitutes in, your gut's already damaged. It's going to struggle trying to process and break that soy down. So this is where soy can become very problematic. Tofu, tofu is almost like pre-digested soy. It's a fermented soy. And the other problem with soy is GMO. Most soy grown in the U.S. specifically today, more than 90% of it is genetically modified. And I don't recommend you go anywhere near genetically modified foods. There's nowhere near enough safety data on them. They're playing, the food manufacturers, they're patenting food. They're patenting what God created in an attempt to take money out of your pocket and put money in their pocket without the ethics and morals that goes behind the safety data testing. And so the data on safety has not been adequately studied for any of these GMO foods. And so you're playing a gamble when you eat them. So it's a great question. If I go gluten-free but my family doesn't and I cook for them, will I get exposed to make a difference in my symptoms? You may. You may, just depending on what you're cooking for them. I mean, if you're baking let's just say you're baking a loaf of bread and you've got the flour and it's aerosolized in the air and you're breathing it in, yeah, you could potentially be reacting. So I would be real cautious about that. With celiac disease in particular, there are a lot of families where they set up what's called a clean area in the kitchen for the individual who is gluten sensitive, which is crazy because in most families, remember, what did I just say? It's genetic, right? So gluten sensitivity is not a disease, it's genetic. So usually what happens is you get one person who has unfortunately been diagnosed with celiac disease, and that person, the rest of the family is like, well, because you have celiac disease, we're going to take you gluten-free, but we're going to keep eating gluten around you. And this is one of the worst things you can do to somebody, right? Because now they feel socially isolated in their own home with their own family, and because gluten sensitivity is genetic, the odds are that everybody else in that family, brothers, sisters, etc., are probably gluten sensitive anyway. They just haven't developed celiac disease. Remember, there's over 100 forms of medical conditions that gluten can cause. Some people develop arthritis. Some people develop non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Some people develop brain fog as an early symptom of gluten exposure. And so just because you don't have celiac disease doesn't mean that you should be eating gluten either. Again, that's if you've got a family member, and there have been studies on this where first-degree relatives of people with celiac disease most commonly have gluten-induced disease, even if it's not celiac disease. It's what we would call extra-intestinal manifestation of gluten exposure, where the damage to that individual is occurring outside of the intestine, so it's not manifesting as celiac disease. Somebody's talking about wild rice. Wild rice is okay. Wild rice is a marsh grass and technically not a grain, so you can eat wild rice and that would be okay. So somebody's asking, what if a food allergy test said I don't react to rice with IgA or IgG? So IgA and IgG. Okay, so you're not reacting in that way. Well, did they pre-qualify the test? Let's just say, because with gluten sensitivity, one of the very common problems is individuals with gluten, and they don't know it, they have IgA deficiency. So if you have IgA deficiency and you use IgA as a tool to measure whether or not you have an antibody to something, because by default, because you have a deficiency of IgA, a lot of times you get a false negative. So not all labs do this, but you have to pre-qualify the test. And what I mean by that is the person who's being tested, the IgA levels need to be checked. Not IgA to specific foods, but just the total IgA. Same thing with the total IgG. You've got to pre-qualify that these individuals are not antibody deficient before you do tests that rely on antibodies to measure whether or not they have a reaction. And so there's IgA, there's IgG, there's IgM, there's IgE, there's something called an immune complex, which most labs don't measure, most labs don't talk about it, and there's something called a T cell response. And so that test you're talking about does not measure these things. You don't measure this, you don't measure that, you don't measure that, you don't measure that, you don't pre-qualify the antibodies here or here. And so what you really have is you have information that's misleading. And so no, I would not rely on a test like that to make the decision as to whether or not you should or shouldn't eat rice. Again, genetic testing. This is why, because you can't trick a genetic test. You either have the genes or you don't. If you have the genes, what that means is that when you expose your body to gluten, whether it's rice, corn, wheat, barley, etc., doesn't matter, you are going to have an immunological response, and that is ingrained into your DNA. Your body's going to perceive that grain protein to be an enemy of the state, and it's going to mount an immune response against it. And these are just the immune responses that we know about. There are many more that I'm certain we have not yet discovered, because every year the science evolves and every year the science gets better, right? And so you don't want to rely on an antiquated type of technology to determine whether you're going to eat something or not. So Josh asks, I can understand low quality brown rice and rice products. How about high quality white rice, or possibly after some healing is done? I don't recommend it, Josh, and I'm not quite sure what you mean by low quality versus high quality. If you want to elaborate on what you're defining the difference between a low and a high quality, because in my opinion, rice is a low quality food, no matter how you look at it, whether it's organic or whether it's not. Because even organic rice contains toxic metal, and again, especially in higher quantities, it's a problem. Let's go down on the left side. Somebody's asking about optimizing nutrition. I'm celiac, I have low iron, how do I optimize my nutrition? The first thing you have to do is stop the damage, and this is again where a lot of people do the diet wrong, is they persistently continue to eat the rice, the corn, the other grains that are labeled gluten-free, and so they continue to struggle with damage. They continue to have inflammatory damage. The GI tract continues to take on damage, and they continue to struggle with malabsorption, and so their iron levels don't come up. Iron's a very common deficiency in people with gluten sensitivity. Actually, it's one of the most common, but I was talking about this earlier. Malnutrition, right? Malnutrition, why? GI inflammation, so damage of the gut, but also generalized inflammation. When your body is generally inflamed, you need more nutrients to repair the inflammatory damage. And so what happens is the inflammation drives up the need for more nutrients, and so you lose gas mileage on nutrition, right? And if you're already eating poor quality foods with low nutrition density, it's very, very hard to overcome. It's very, very hard to overcome malnutrition if you don't change your diet appropriately. So Linda says, I have a young friend, 32, whose intestines are so damaged that they're planning to insert a pacemaker-like device to stimulate movement. I think he has celiac, but when I asked him about it, he said he tested negative. This was 15 years ago. Any suggestions? Find new doctors. I mean, a pacemaker to stimulate movement in the bowel, you've got to figure out why the intestines are damaged. I mean, that makes zero sense. Let's put a machine in use because we don't know why you're broken. Somebody has got to be more investigative in that arena. Otherwise, that young man is in for a hell of a life, a tortuous life. Should you repeat an IgG test, and if so, how often? Well, I don't recommend using just specifically IgG antibody tests to measure to see whether or not you're allergic to foods. I think IgG tests are one of the most misleading types of tests as it relates to food reactivity. So not the type of technology I would even recommend doing once, much less repeating it. There are other technologies that are far more advanced. Thoughts on coconut water, kefir, and cabbage? I think cabbage is great. Coconut water, kefir, you know, if you're making it at home possibly, but you got to look at a lot of those kefirs and look at what they're fermenting them with and be very careful about that. Coconut water has a lot of sugar. A lot of people don't realize that. I had one time I had a young patient, you know, she was drinking, you know, this was a lot, but she was drinking like 6 to 8 of these coconut waters a day, and it was rotting her teeth out. She went back to her dentist. She was trying to be gluten-free, and that's what she was using to nourish herself, and she gave herself so many calories. There's a lot of sugar in coconut water. So again, depending on how long you ferment the coconut water so that the microorganisms have enough time to eat and consume all of the sugar, otherwise you can get into trouble with it. Devorah says, since when did rice have gluten? Forever. It's always had a form of gluten. That's not new news. It's just that, again, when doctors are talking about rice versus wheat, barley, and rye and celiac disease, they're all focused on one kind of gluten. Predominantly the type of gluten is called gliadin. And unfortunately, it's an inaccurate and underrepresented viewpoint. And this is, again, why so many people persistently stay sick, even though they've gone on a traditional gluten-free diet. Yeah, this is a good one. So Paul says, so those gluten-free storage food packs are probably garbage I can't eat. Yes, good point. A lot of the emergency food rations, the powdered foods that you can buy online, most of those are the gluten-free options are mostly full of a bunch of rice and corn. Yeah, it's garbage. You don't want to eat it. My advice is if you're trying to get emergency food and plan ahead for the potential of an emergency, there's a lot better ways to do it than buying that processed powdered stuff. I would never want to be in a situation where I had to eat that. The brain fog and the dysfunction and the inflammation would make you so unprepared to deal with any kind of emergency. Just not a good idea. Hey, if you've got a functional medicine or health question that you'd like me to answer for you, make sure you send me an email, glutenology@gmail.com, and we'll do our best to create a video answer just for you. Have a great day.